everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. If you're new to my channel, my name is Melissa and I'm a nursing student. Okay, so if you've not seen my last couple of videos, I am currently in the process of moving. That's why my background is a mess, so I'm sorry for that. But I'm gonna go right ahead and get into the topic of today's video. So in my last video, I talked about my experience taking pediatrics, the lecture. Now this video is going to be all about my experience in clinical. Okay, so I'll start off by saying two things. The very first thing is this was definitely one of my favorite clinicals so far in the nursing program. This clinical was incredible. I cannot say enough good things about my clinical instructor. I cannot say enough good things about the hospital that I was at. I absolutely loved this clinical. That's the first thing I'll say. Second thing I'll say is that despite all of that, this clinical was confirmation for me that pediatrics is not for me at all. And I think I'll get into that more at the end of the video. I'll do like a little summary. First, I'm just going to talk about my clinical experience. So if you've not seen my previous videos, I attend Chamberlain University. I'm in their evening and weekend BSN program. And I'm a senior now, so I just finished taking pediatrics. And at least at Chamberlain, you kind of have some say in where you take, like where you do your clinicals. So when you register, every session that you register for classes and for clinical, you'll have a choice. Sometimes you'll have a choice of 5 clinical sites, and you can try to register for the one that you really want. If you don't get into that, you may get your second choice. It just depends on availability. Other sessions, you may only have 2 places available for clinical, and you have to just choose between one or the other, and you get what you get. So each session is kind of different. For peds, I had an option of a couple of places. I would say I had a decent amount of options. And so I was really intentional about where I chose to go to clinical because I knew going into peds, I didn't want to count it out because I always say go into every clinical and every specialty and every class with an open mind. But starting nursing school, peds was the one specialty where I was pretty sure I was just not going to go into. I always said it was peds and geriatrics because I've worked in geriatrics before and I said I wouldn't return, but I've actually changed my mind. I would work in geriatrics, which is an older population. I would not work in peds. Now that I've gone to clinical with an open mind, I would not work in peds. But I knew that I didn't want to just kind of go to a regular peds unit or a regular pediatric setting. So when I registered for classes, I was very fortunate and I saw that there was an emergency department. So a pediatric hospital, so a hospital dedicated to children, and my clinical would be in the emergency department. And so to me, that experience was invaluable. And the second I saw it, I went ahead and registered for that clinical just because I want to get as much experience during clinical as possible. And I'm pretty sure that the emergency department is not a typical clinical rotation. Like, I don't think all nursing students get to have experience in the emergency department. I don't think all nursing students get to have experience in the ICU. All nursing students do get experience in like med surg and maternity and things like that. But these other specialties, anytime that they pop up, I automatically will try to sign up for them just so I can get that experience. So now I've worked in a couple of different ICUs, and now thanks to this clinical, I have worked in an emergency department. It was a fast track emergency department, but it was still an emergency department nonetheless. So for my clinical, I had 48 hours of clinical. I believe it was 48 hours. Let me get this out and do the math. Clinicals are usually either 96 hours or 48 hours. Yes, my clinical was 48 hours. And I did not have 12-hour clinicals. My clinicals were actually 8 hours. So I had 8-hour days. And so I had to go to the hospital 6 weeks. I had clinical every Saturday. And so every Saturday I went to the hospital. I spent 8 hours there. So I went to the hospital, I went to the hospital 5 weeks. And then the 6th week I went to sim lab. So I'll talk about sim lab first. If you have not seen my previous videos, or if you're not familiar with sim lab is actually when you go to campus and there is a simulation, which is what sim lab is short for. There's a simulated lab where you have a mannequin or a dummy that's very high tech. They have a heartbeat, they have respirations. I believe they even blink and you can like see their chest moving. It's so cool. But you go into sim lab with your clinical group, and you have, usually it's like an emergency situation. So you'll go in, something will be going on with your patient, and you have to use your skills and figure out how to stabilize your patient or get the situation under control. And so I never go into what the situation is for sim lab because I never want to enter into like any realms of cheating. But I will just say this was pediatrics, so we had a pediatric mannequin, and the sim was focused on things that you learn for peds. So when I wasn't at sim lab, every other week I went to the hospital. So like I mentioned, I went to fast track. So even though it was the emergency department, it was like a subset of the emergency department. So typically you'll have like a child come into the ED with their parents, and they're kind of sectioned off into two sections. One section is like a true emergency, and then the other section is like, you know, the kid is sick, but it's not necessarily urgent. It's just a form of triaging, kind of separating the more critical or the more high acuity patients from things like a stomach ache or a headache, things that you would kind of typically go to urgent care for. You went to fast track, and fast track is where I did my clinical. So for this clinical, typically on a day-to-day basis, what I would do is I would go in with my clinical team, my cohort. There were only 3 of us, including myself there. So there was 3 of us and our instructor. So I got a lot of one-on-one, really valuable, like hands-on learning in this clinical, which is why I love this clinical. So typically a day-to-day, we'd go in, we'd all meet up. I would go on the unit with everybody, listen to report being given, and then we would kind of clean out. We would like take down or clean out and reset each room. So since it was like an emergency department, if you've ever been to the ED, they have like these little rooms so that people can wait and be seen. It's like a little mini doctor's office in each room. And so we would strip that, completely sanitize it, set it up for the next patient. And since it was not only emergency department, but it was fast track, it was just a lot of turnover, like faster turnover than I've ever seen, of course, because the goal of the emergency department is to stabilize patients enough to send them to their next destination, whether that's an admission in the hospital, whether that's to go home. Their goal is not to stay in the emergency department forever and ever. The goal is to stabilize the patient, get them well enough to send them on their way to the next stage, wherever that may be. So there was a lot of turnover, and every time there was turnover, me and my classmates would go into the room, strip down the room, sanitize the room, make sure all of the supplies were in the room for the next patient and for the next family. Then we would also go out into the waiting room and call back patients and families. We would put them into a room, and then we would do an initial assessment on the patient. So we would go out to the waiting room. We'd be given a patient to call back. We'd go out to the waiting room. We'd call the patient. We would usher them into a room that we got to select. We'd let the nurse know, or the unit manager, the charge nurse, we'd let them know which room we put the patient in. And then we would go back into the room and we would do an assessment on them. So we'd get their background, why they came to the hospital, who they came to the hospital with, when their symptoms started. And then we would, listen to their lungs. We would do their vital signs. We would do an assessment on them, which I thought was really cool. I actually really like doing assessments. And this clinical, I cannot count how many assessments I got to do. It was a lot of fun. I spent the entire clinical, every day I was at the hospital, I spent the entire time on my feet, running around, just doing something. I was not just sitting around. It was really, really cool. And then after we did the assessment, we would go back with our clinical instructor and we would document our findings and document like all the vital signs and everything from our patient. And we would do that under our clinical instructor's supervision. And then we would she spoke to the doctor. It wasn't us calling the doctor because how doctors can get, and we're just students and we don't have our licenses yet. So my clinical instructor or the nurse that we were working with would call the doctor, kind of get an order for medication, and then we would go in with my clinical instructor and we would administer medication. Really, I only administered oral meds because there were a lot of stomach aches, nausea, headaches. So it was really simple medication that was just oral. And so I got to, of course, scan my patient, do all of the patient like rights for medication, administer the medication, and then document that all with my professor right there. And it was a lot easier because my clinical group was so small. In the past, I've had bigger clinical groups where my professor would be with somebody else and then a patient would need medication and I can't give the med without my licensed clinical instructor being there. So I'd either have to wait around or the nurse would kind of get impatient and the nurse would just be like, I'll just do it myself. So with this clinical, I really got to be hands-on because my clinical instructor was kind of everywhere at once since there were so few of us, which is really cool. And I will say this clinical taught me a lot about myself and what type of nurse I'm going to, like what type of person I am, what type of nurse I'm going to be. And one thing that was really different about this clinical, like in the past, I've been very fortunate. I got to have a clinical in the ICU, the cardiac ICU, which that by far was my favorite clinical. And I definitely, as of today, if I had to choose a specialty, I would choose ICU nurse. I feel like that's just kind of like my calling. But with the ICU, it's very thorough. And I am very good at assessments. I'm good at doing like head to toe full body assessments. With the emergency department, it's very much, you're giving focused assessments. So you're not, if someone comes in for a stomach ache, unless there's a specific reason to, you're not going to be auscultating their lungs and their cardiac area. You're not going to be looking for respiratory issues unless there's a reason to. If someone comes in for a stomach ache, you of course do their vital signs, you get their background, and you will be palpating and auscultating their abdomen and then anything else in relation to that. At least with the emergency department, it's very much what the person came in for, that is what you are treating. You're not worried about everything else that's ever been wrong with the patient and all of their other issues, just because it's so busy and it's so fast paced. So as much as I liked that, I kind of had a hard time with that. I feel like I'm really good at doing like a thorough full body assessment. And so it kind of took me a while to get into the habit of doing more focused assessments and just learning how to triage, really, which I feel like is another really big part of the ED. So this experience was great. I do think I could be an ER nurse, but I think that it's more natural for me to be more like an ICU nurse. So it was really interesting. I loved the experience. Sorry, my battery died. So when it comes to me and pediatrics, this is definitely the one specialty that I've officially decided I'm not going to go into, just because I feel like it takes a very special person to take care of sick kids, and that is just not my calling, if I could put it lightly. I feel like there are a lot of misconceptions about pediatrics that, like, now that I've done clinical in it, I feel like it's not the same as working in it completely. There's a lot that I did not see. I feel like a big thing I always hear people talk about is I'll hear people say that they don't want to go into peds because they don't want to have to deal with parents that are like nagging them and crazy and hovering over their kids. And I will just say that, like, yeah, you can get parents that are a bit helicoptery, which, I mean, understandably so. Like, that's their child is sick, so of course naturally they're anxious. So yes, you do deal with that, but if that is your main reason for not wanting to go into pediatrics, I would say don't let that be your reason, just because you're going to encounter that in literally every bedside specialty that you go into. Like, I've worked in geriatrics for years, and no, you're not dealing with parents, you're dealing with children. So you'll be taking care of like an 85-year-old patient, and no, their parents not yelling at you like the pediatric parents are yelling at you, but maybe their like 50-year-old kid is cussing you out and cursing at you and just being aggressive. Or even if you're not working in geriatrics, if you're working with just like a regular aged or middle-aged adult, their spouse could be yelling at you, and their spouse could be hovering over you acting crazy. Their cousin, their neighbor. Like, pediatrics is not, it's not like it's a situation where you're going to be dealing with like crazy parents and you're not going to experience that in any other specialty. You're going to be dealing with aggressive, and I don't want to put people off, but if that is your reason, you're going to experience that in probably any bedside specialty that you go into, whether it's peds, whether it's geriatrics, whether it's ICU. You're dealing with sick people, and anytime you're dealing with sick people, you're most likely going to have to encounter their super anxious, stressed out family members, whether that's a parent, a child, spouse, whoever. So that's not really, in my opinion, a valid reason to not go into pediatrics. Non-compliance is another one. Yes, children can be extremely non-compliant, mostly because, especially when you're working with small children, you can't really reason with them to say, I know you don't want to take this medication, but it'll help you feel better. I know you don't want to do X, Y, and Z, but it'll help you get better. If you're working with kids under a certain age, they're not going to be able to comprehend that, and they're not going to be compliant. But I have, again, worked with older adults who understand that medication can help them. They understand the risks of smoking or drinking, and they're still going to do whatever they want to do anyway. So you're gonna encounter non-compliance in any specialty that you go to. But the reason why I particularly don't want to do pediatrics is, like I mentioned, I think it takes a very special person to take care of children. Even when we were administering oral medications to children, kids would just be crying and acting like they were in pain. And it just made me uncomfortable. Like, I don't like seeing kids uncomfortable. I don't like seeing kids in pain. I don't like working with kids in pain. I don't think I have the patience. I have more patience for a non-compliant adult than I do for a non-compliant child. It just, so for a number of different reasons, it just definitely wasn't for me. I didn't insert an IV, but I helped to remove a IV from a child. And even before I touched the IV, just taking off the tape surrounding the IV, just like the adhesive being ripped off of their skin, even with me using alcohol to make things softer and to make it more gentle for them, they were just like crying and screaming bloody murder. And I wanted to cry. I was just like, I can't do this. I don't like making kids hurt. I don't like scaring kids. And I know that there's so much more to pediatrics than that. I know that you're helping children. I know you're helping them feel better, but it's just not for me. And going into it, I was pretty confident that it was not for me. But I think going into it, I had different reasons. Like, one of my reasons was I don't want to have to deal with the parents. I don't have the patience for children. And so I did like working with them. There was definitely a level of compassion for my patients that I didn't realize I was going to have. Like, anytime that they would cry, even if I knew that they were being dramatic and I wasn't hurting them, I just felt so compassionate towards them. I just wanted to stop their pain. I wanted to do whatever I could to stop them from crying, even if that meant not giving them the medication that they needed. And so I feel like that also compromises the level that I'm able to care for my patients. If I don't know. So it's just not for me. I really enjoyed this clinical a lot. And that's saying a lot since I don't want to go into peds. So for me to have probably the most positive experience that I could have had at a clinical site, and to have like one of the best clinical instructors that I've had so far in the program, and to still say, I don't think pediatrics is for me, I feel like I can confidently say this is the one specialty I'm not going to go into. But with that being said, I still think you should go into every clinical with an open mind, because you never know which rotation or which clinical you're going to fall in love with. There were definitely people in my cohort that thought that they wanted to do peds, and once we finished this class and finished this clinical rotation, they were just like, yo, peds is not for me. And then I actually have one classmate, a really good friend, I don't think she was ever opposed to peds, but it definitely, I don't think it was on her radar before this clinical. And literally like halfway through this clinical, she fell in love with it. And the way she talks about it, it's definitely her calling. So I always say, go into clinical with an open mind. You never know what is going to stick. But peds did not stick with me. And I'm really happy to be done with this class and to be done with this clinical. So that is it for this video. If you made it to the end, thank you so much for watching. I apologize for my messy background. I gotta get back to packing and moving, but thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Oh, I forgot. So next session, I always talk about the classes I'm going to take next. Next session, I normally would be taking maternity. Everybody in my cohort is going to be taking maternity. My degree plan has changed for personal reasons, so I will be taking community next. So even though my degree plan's changed, the order that I'm taking classes is different than it was originally slated for me, but I'm still going to be graduating at the same time by the grace of God if I pass all my classes. So it's not like my time in the program is going to be extended, but I will be taking community health next instead of maternity. And I'm going to be taking maternity, I believe, in November. So that's different and I'm really nervous. Hopefully it goes well. Wish me luck. Pray for me. Thank you guys for watching this video and I will see you in the next one.